Welcome back to another episode of the Primal Shift Podcast. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about something that most people don't know about, and even those who know often use it incorrectly or make mistakes leveraging that powerful tool. And of course, I'm talking about heart rate variability, or HRV. So in this episode specifically, I'll talk about what is HRV, why does it matter, and what does it tell us, or can it tell us? How you can use HRV to your advantage to improve your health and well-being, the best ways and tools to measure HRV. That's where I think a lot of mistakes are being made. How I use HRV to improve my own health and well-being. And I'm going to point to some additional resources that talk about how you can improve your HRV and answer the question, what is a good HRV? That's actually, I think, the number one question I get on the topic, because most people don't know how to interpret their reading. But let's start with the basics. What is heart rate variability, or HRV? And HRV is the difference in timing between heartbeats expressed in milliseconds. What that means is, assume you have a heart rate of 60 beats per minute. You might think that, well, if that's the case, then my heart beats exactly once a second on the dot. But that's not necessarily true. In fact, your heart might beat at 980 milliseconds, and then again at 1050 milliseconds, and then at 970 milliseconds. So there's always a little bit of a difference or a variability, and that is your heart rate variability, basically the difference in that timing between the individual heartbeat. But why does it matter? What does heart rate variability tell us about our health, our nervous system? And the number one thing that HRV tells us is it gives us an indication of how our nervous system is responding to our environment and the stressors we're exposed to. More specifically speaking, HRV tells us what's going on in terms of the competition between the sympathetic and parasympathetic branch of our nervous system. So those two branches, they're always in competition. They're always active at the same time, but one is usually more active than the other. And that's important because if you think about it, your sympathetic branch is the one that is predominantly active when you're in a fight or flight mode. So when you're in danger, when your certain functions in your body need to be in focus so you can either escape danger or fight. The problem is, in our modern worlds, we're often in fight or flight mode, even though there is no saber-toothed tiger, trying to attack us, or no other tribe member trying to attack us. It's simply triggered by parenting, by work, by a host of other things that shouldn't really put us into a fight or flight mode because they are not life-threatening, but our brain doesn't know the difference. And so we are in it anyway. And a lot of people are in chronic fight or flight mode. And that's obviously not good because it taxes your body. You cannot always be in fight or flight mode. That's just not healthy and leads to a lot of those issues that we've discussed in some of the previous episodes. So HRV tells us how active or dominant our sympathetic branch of the nervous system might be. So in relation to your baseline, we'll talk about it in a bit. If you have a relatively low HRV, that means your sympathetic branch is more active. Conversely, if your HRV is relatively high, that means your parasympathetic branch, the one that's responsible for resting and digesting, is more active. And throughout the day, unless you're exercising or being exposed to acute stressors, you should really be in parasympathetic mode as much as possible. But that's, again, unfortunately not always the case for most of us. And so by looking at our HRV, by measuring our HRV, we can tell how our nervous system is responding. Are we more in sympathetic mode or parasympathetic mode? And that's in particularly important if we measure HRV during certain times when we're not exposed to external influences. Like if we are sleeping, in particular when we're in deep sleep, we are not exposed to any acute stressors at that time. The body is pretty much disconnected from its environment, from its surroundings. And so if we measure HRV at that time, and it's relatively low, that's an indication that our nervous system and some of the other processes and organs in the body, especially the heart, are busy trying to compensate or heal and repair from some of those stressors we were exposed to throughout the day, for example, or in the previous days leading up to that particular night. So that can tell us if we are in overtraining, maybe if we are not allowing enough time to recover after intense workouts. It can tell us how capable or resilient our body is in dealing with everyday stressors. It can give us an idea if we are sick or if we're about to get sick, even before we feel the onset of symptoms. It can even tell you if you're pregnant, if there is a high chance of preterm delivery. There have been studies conducted by Whoop, one of the trackers that I use to measure HRV, that have clearly shown that pregnant women that have a sudden change in HRV during a certain stage of the pregnancy are very likely to have a preterm delivery. And so all of that is important information that you can leverage to make changes, to improve your situation, to improve your health, and to better deal with stress, of course. It can also tell you, HRV that is, if you're making the proper lifestyle choices throughout the day and in the evening, maybe, if you're consuming alcohol, for example, your HRV is likely going to be lower at night. If you're very stressed throughout the day, your HRV is going to take a hit. If you're making the wrong dietary choices, if you have poor sleep, all of those things can lead to a low HRV and give you an indication if there is maybe room for improvement or something that you need to do. So what does it mean in practice? How can you leverage HRV to your advantage or use it to your advantage? And so one of the things you can do is to establish a baseline, because HRV is a very individual metric. It doesn't make sense, we'll talk about that in a bit, to compare your HRV with that of someone else. You really need to establish your own baseline to find out what is a normal HRV for you. And you typically do this by measuring it for a certain period, couple of weeks maybe, especially during a time when you're not exposed to external influences, like during sleep, for example, or maybe first time in the morning. We'll talk about the best ways and tools to measure HRV, but you need to establish a baseline. You need to know what is a normal HRV for you. And from there, you can monitor changes or trends that deviate from your baseline, either above average or above your baseline or below your baseline. And then you can assess those trends and see what lifestyle choices or environmental factors could be influencing a change in the trend. Obviously, if you're trending up, that's a good thing. If you're trending down, there is something going on that warrants further investigation. Could be maybe that you're getting sick or that you're constantly overtraining without giving your body enough time to recover. All of those things can lead to a downward trend in HRV and give you the tools or at least the information to make changes and the proper adaptations, maybe to a training regimen or to your alcohol consumption, whatever the cause might be. Now, HRV is also useful to assess temporary changes and think about how they relate to lifestyle choices you've been making, particularly the night before or the day before. So for example, I woke up this morning and I looked at my HRV readings from the night and it was relatively low. In fact, it was very low, and so I'm like, okay, what did I do yesterday that caused my body to having a harder time recovering and repairing at night? I assessed, we watched the Christmas lights last night and I wasn't hungry before heading out, and then it took forever because there was a lot of traffic going on and we came home late and I had a late meal. For me, I already know this. That's a trigger to lower my HRV because my body has to work harder digesting stuff at a time where it should be directing resources at doing some other things, resting and recovering and muscle recovery and all of the things that are not directly related to, digesting a heavy meal. And I was hungry at the time, so I had a big meal, right before going to bed. Not a good thing. I already knew what would happen, and it did. And I could see it reflected in my HRV. I also knew that I had stressful moments yesterday related to parenting. And so I knew what caused my dip in HRV. Not a big deal, moving on. If that dip had happened or that drop in HRV had happened without me being able to figure out what is going on, there is a real possibility that I might be getting sick or that my body is starting to fight something, even if I don't feel any symptoms yet. And so for me, that's always an indication to lay low, to take it easier, to focus more on recovery than maybe going to the gym and pushing it, to the red line and doing a ton of other things that stress me and take away resources that my body might need to fight an infection or whatever the case might be. So that's how you can leverage, HRV, and how I leverage this as well. Now, how do you measure HRV and when particularly? I already alluded to HRV. You need to measure HRV best case scenario when you're without any external influences. And while in deep sleep is arguably one of the best times to do that because your body is pretty much disconnected from its environment, from its surroundings. And so it's a great way to measure HRV. And some of the tools that we'll talk about here in a moment do exactly that. They measure it at night, and some of them particularly during deep sleep. The other alternative, if you don't have a tool that can measure it, at a set time, you obviously, cannot measure it actively while you're in deep sleep. You'd have to wake up for that. But if you have a chest strap, let's say, or maybe an Apple Watch or something else to measure your HRV, you can also do it first thing in the morning, ideally when you're at rest and when your heart rate is close to or at resting heart rate, because typically when your heart rate goes up, your HRV goes down. As simple as if you monitor it with a chest strap, if I get up and start walking, just the fact that I walk lowers my HRV significantly. If I sit back down, it bounces right back. So it's important to be at rest, and ideally always during the same time of the day. Morning is a good time. First thing in the morning, you sit up, you make sure you're relaxed. There are no kids and pets or whatever running around you and driving you crazy or whatever. You need to be with as few influences as possible, and then you can measure it, do it at the same time every single day, and do it for a while to establish a baseline. And then you can use those morning readings, for example, to see if your numbers deviate from the established baseline. You can also measure your HRV throughout the day, but that's mostly useful as a stress monitoring tool. So it's not very useful to figure out if lifestyle choices have a systemic effect on your body. In other words, a low HRV at some point during the day, maybe when you're out and about, is not going to give you any indication whatsoever if you're in overtraining, if you might be getting sick or anything in between, But it's useful if you measure 24/7 the whole time, basically, to see individual spikes or drops and use that as a stress monitoring tool. Because typically when you're stressed, as we talked about, sympathetic overdrive, etc., your HRV goes down. And if you're not exercising or, working out or doing any type of manual labor, anything that might constitute a stress, and your HRV suddenly drops and you're not physically active at the time, that's an indication that your sympathetic branch of the nervous system is active because you're under stress. You're showing a stress response. And some of the tools that I use here, for example, the whip strap here or the Aura ring, they can measure HRV throughout the day and then give you a stress score, or even send you a notification saying that, hey, you've been in high stress mode. They use HRV among some other factors, but the bottom line here is they tell you, hey, you've been in high stress mode for a significant amount of time. What's going on? Maybe it's time to take a breath or, do something to mitigate the stressful situation. So very useful if you want to use a stress monitor, but if you really want to use it to establish your recovery and get an idea of how your nervous system is handling the stressors from the previous day or previous days, measure it at night, best case scenario, or maybe in the morning. Again, if you do it in the morning, you can use an Apple Watch. There is, it can measure HRV, even though it might not be the best way of doing this, or you can use a chest strap with an app, like there is Elite HRV or some other tools you can use to take on-demand readings and use those to figure out what might be going on. So let's talk about some of the mistakes that a lot of people make when measuring HRV. And one is, I already alluded to it, measuring it during random times of the day, especially if you don't want to use it as a stress management tool. So measuring, one day at 3 p.m. and the next day in the morning and then again in the evening, and then it's not going to give you any actionable or useful information. Those snapshots don't really matter if there are external influences that you cannot control for. That's why, again, deep sleep, best time followed by first thing in the morning, if you really want to understand how your body is handling the stressors that you're exposed to. The second mistake that a lot of people make is they freak out when they see a low reading. On Whoop, I think, does a fairly good job of assessing your HRV and some of the other biometrics to give you a recovery score in the morning. And they represent it in either red, yellow, or green, which everyone knows kind of what those colors mean. Green is good, yellow is, in between, and red, not so good, especially as far as your health is concerned. And so a lot of people, when they wake up and they see a red recovery or maybe a low HRV reading, using the Aura ring or any other tool, they freak out and like, oh, today I cannot go work out. I am basically disabled. I should not be doing anything. And that's not true. Having low HRV readings, especially in the context of exercise, is a good thing, because you need to sometimes overreach to become stronger and more resilient and fitter. You need to push your body, and then your body needs time to repair. And during that time, your HRV might be low. So if I go work out and I do a very intense, CrossFit workout, and then I'm sore and, completely fatigued and whatnot, and then I go to bed, during that night, my body is likely working very hard to recover from that workout. And so the next morning, I don't necessarily expect a very high HRV, because the low HRV is an indication that my body is working actively to recover. And so my HRV is low, and that's perfectly fine. There's nothing to freak out about. It does not mean that I cannot go work out that day, or I shouldn't go work out that day, or that I have to sit on the couch all day. It does not. It just means that I should be aware that my body has had maybe a harder time than usual because the workout was tougher to recover. And so maybe, I take it easier, or maybe I don't take it easy and I push it again because I know that a day later I have a rest day coming up. So it can be a helpful tool in the realm of exercise, but it could also mean that, if you had a late meal or you had maybe a glass of wine too much or whatever the case might be, and you wake up with a low HRV, it's not a big deal. You'll still function. I've had some of my best performances on a day where I woke up with a low HRV. It just means that, but if you have multiple low readings in a row, if you have, a week or longer of low HRV, something is likely going on and you need to think what that might be and react accordingly. For example, if you know or if you feel like your low HRV trend is caused by overtraining, well, back off on your overtraining, give your body more time to recover. If you can absolutely not figure out what it might be, maybe you're sick or you're about to get sick. So that's also might be an indication to lay low and take it easier and see how your body responds in the following days where you give it more time to recover. Next mistake, big one that caused or has caused a lot of stress and anxiety among many of the users, especially users of devices like Whoop and Oura Ring, is comparing your HRV to that of someone else. HRV is a very individual metric. Everyone has a different baseline, different genetics, different environment that cause certain readings, and so it does not make any sense. And I highly encourage you to not compare your HRV with that of someone else, even if you're same sex, roughly same age, same level of fitness or whatever. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't help you at all. Now, of course, if you see this in a positive light and say, okay, there is someone who is very comparable or similar to how I am, but that person's HRV is twice of mine, maybe there is something you can improve without freaking out about it, because maybe there is nothing you can do and maybe it's completely irrelevant. You might not be any less healthy just because your HRV is low. In fact, I know many people who are less fit than I am and less healthy than I am who have a higher average HRV. So what? Does it mean there's an issue? Probably not. It might just be genetics. It might be something else. Not everything related to HRV we understand yet. So take it easy and don't freak out about it. Now, I've already talked about some of the things that I do in regards to HRV and leveraging that information it gives me to improve my health and well-being. And I measure my HRV typically at night. I use 8 Sleep. It's a bed cooling solution that has sensors built in that measures heart rate and HRV and some respiratory rate and some other metrics. And I use that pretty much every single night, or I look at it in the morning to see how my numbers were during the previous night and how they line up with what I know about my previous day or days and how I feel in the morning. I don't freak out about it if there is something off or I can't explain it, but it's always interesting if something doesn't quite line up to figure out what it could be and to just be conscious about it and use that information to do better the following day. I also wear Whoop and Oura Ring, not all the time, just on off, usually to compare to what 8 Sleep is showing me, to test new features, to test, to use the stress monitor, that's very useful of both of those devices really, so I can see when I'm in high stress mode throughout the day, especially during times when I don't recognize that's to be the case. So that's what I use as well. And I always look at trends. I do look at individual readings as well, of course, but I mostly pay attention to my trends. And is my trend flat, which is okay, because usually HRV declines as we age, right? Someone who is 20 years old, chances are much higher HRV than someone like me who is now turning 42. But the average trend shows, at least statistically, the older we get, the lower the HRV. And so my goal is to beat the inflation as much as I can, meaning that to maintain either a steady trend or an upward trend. And there are actually many things that I've done in the past that have helped me improve my HRV, by 50%. And I'm linking those down in the show notes so you can look at those additional resources. But I keep an eye on trend, most importantly. Also take into account individual readings and really try to assess how they line up with my lifestyle choices and factors that I've been exposed to that were not necessarily my choice. If you get into a car accident, there might not have been anything you could do about it, but that likely impacts your stress levels, especially in the moment, and maybe even for longer. It might, even if you got injured, that can be an HRV lowering factor as your body tries to repair and recover from that injury. So I try to assess how my readings line up with lifestyle choices, and if there is something I can do better, like not have alcohol at all, or only have it once a week maybe instead of, twice a week, or whatever the case might be, avoid late meals, don't overtrain, all of those things I try to assess and optimize and do better so I can be healthier for longer, improve my health span basically, and not decline, right? That's how I use HRV. I'm not militant about it. I'm not, like hover over every single reading and try to, analyze it, the heck out of it. No, I look at it in the morning first thing, okay, all good, or that needs some thinking what it could be, and then I move on. I don't compare to anyone else. I just compare to my own baseline and see what's going on and what I can improve. Some additional resources. If you're now, HRV is super interesting, or you might already have been, measuring your HRV and you want to take it to the next step, I highly encourage you to check out. I have a video and a blog post on how I've improved my HRV. Not a blog post is slightly more current because I updated it several times since releasing it. The video has also most of the information in there, but there are some additional stuff in the blog post that you might find interesting. So check that out if you think there is room for improvement. Usually there always is. And then what's a good HRV? That's I wrote a blog post about it and I did a video as well, because that's a question I get quite a lot. I've been getting quite a lot. And just to give you some framework without diving into all the details that I covered in the article and video, but 65 milliseconds for men and 62 for women across all ages appears to be, the average, and there are obviously discrepancies, and it does not take the individual age brackets into account. As I've mentioned, the younger you are, chances are the higher your HRV is. The older you are, the lower your HRV is in comparison. But on average, 65 and 62 milliseconds for men and women respectively. But check out the article. It goes into much more details on what constitutes a good HRV and how to assess your own readings that you can then use to kind of figure out if what you are seeing is within the realm of normal or if there is room maybe for improvement, and then you can use the other article to make those improvements. With that, we're going to wrap it up. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Until next time.